All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mike to New Haven podcast, episode 116. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was volume 15 of Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad, with a former housing cop who later became a bomb tech, Jeff Oberdeer. Jeff came on the housing police in 1990, made it over upon the merger of the departments in 95, joined the bomb squad, and had a very, very close seat and observation of some of the city's most notorious events, from terrorist plots to, of course, the events of September 11th, as well as the attempted Times Square bombing in 2010. Jeff certainly had an eventful 15 years in the bomb squad, and it was good to talk to him for a mini-series that, like I said, has become one of the major backbones of this show. So from the bomb squad back towards, I should say, a different form of a squad room with my next guest, who spent almost a quarter century hunting down all the criminals New York City had to offer, joining the since defunct New York City Housing Authority Police in 1980. The next 15 years saw him work his way up from patrol officer all the way to commanding officer of the Major Case Squad, when the NYPD absorbed both the housing police and transit police. In the spring of 1995, he would continue his rise upon the merger, overseeing later on in his career 75th and 90th Precinct Detective Squads, and eventually a certain portion of the Manhattan Detective Bureau. Eventually becoming a deputy chief, he also oversaw investigations into counterterrorism and other matters as part of the intelligence division, and retired in 2004, but remains active nonetheless. He currently runs his own PI firm, Cutter Investigations, and wrote a book not too long ago, The Squad Room. Joining us now is retired Chief John Cutter. John, welcome. How are you?
Welcome, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. First question, always an easy one. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up on Long Island, but have spent the majority of my career in the city, including pre-police department and post-police department.
There you go. So not a lot of people knew, and we'll talk about getting into housing as we go here. Not a lot of people knew about housing. Not a lot of people, some people knew about transit, because obviously taking the subways, you see transit, but housing was kind of a thing that unless you lived in the projects, you didn't know who they were. So you go into the academy. And I remember our mutual friend, Scott Wagner, mentioning this, before a certain point in the 80s, I think these different police departments had their own individual academies. Was that what you went into, or did you go into NYPD Academy and then get assigned out to housing?
Well, actually what happened was I had taken an NYPD police exam back, I guess, in 1978 or 79. And I got a phone call one day to come to the New York City Police Academy because they were looking to hire police officers. They didn't say anything more than that. Of course, I went down, and there were several hundred people in the room, and a bunch of detectives and sergeants and other ranks were talking to us throughout the day. And finally, they said, well, the people that are here today, in order for you to get on the job, you're going to have to take a job today, but that job will be with either the New York City Housing Authority or with the Transit Authority police departments, not the NYPD, and that the list would be dying after this date. So that's how I ended up in the housing police, by getting on a line and walking down the hall and into a room, and four people sitting there go, which department would you like? And I said, I'll take the housing police. And they said to me, oh, congratulations. You're the first guy to say you take the housing police. And there were 20 people online in front of me. At first, I thought, did I just make a big mistake? But in the long run, it was absolutely not a mistake. It was a great choice and a great career and time in the housing police.
John Cutter is our guest here in the Mike to New Haven podcast. This is episode 116. Did you always want to be a police officer, or originally were you going to have your eyes set on another career field?
Actually, originally I was looking to be a veterinarian. I had a long family history with the police. My brother was a member of the NYPD. He retired a first grade detective out of the 9th Precinct Detective Squad. I had several uncles who were in the police department way back in the day. So I had a long-standing history with them. I took the test because it was something to do at the time, and I wasn't 100% sure that that's how I wanted to go. But once I was called, I knew it was the right thing to do and the right place to be for me.
The 80s kept housing very busy. Drugs were very, very prominent at the time, and a lot of these drugs were being dealt, well, pretty much everywhere during the height of the crack craze, but especially in projects is where drug dealers had their businesses. and were operating. So as a young rookie cop coming on the job in 80, 81, trying to learn, trying to keep your head on a swivel for people like that, who would you say was instrumental in helping you acquire what's come to be known basically as, well, cop instincts?
I think I got a little bit from my brother before I even actually hit the street. He talked to me quite a bit about it, having been on the job for quite a while for me, who's 11 years older. He had actually worked in the 103 precinct as a uniformed cop, and unfortunately, at a robbery, his partner was shot and killed, and my brother shot the individual that shot him, and he was captured 3 days later down south. So my brother had quite a career before I got there. And then once I was on the job, the training officer that I worked with, he had been a veteran of the housing police for probably more than 20 years when I first met him. And he kind of showed me the ropes, as did a number of other senior guys that had been working in the housing authority.
By chance, because I don't know who this was exactly, was his partner Louis Miller?
No, it wasn't Louis Miller. No, it was actually the training officer was a guy we used to call Pop Reynolds. And like I said, he'd been around the job for a long time. There were other guys, Donnie Duran, Freddie Friegel, another guy named Clark. There were a bunch of guys, Jimmy Wilson, who had been around. And, you know, the one thing about the housing police that was slightly different than the NYPD is very often you were on your own. You were walking into projects. You went to jobs without backup. So you had to learn pretty quickly how to talk to people, how to calm people down, because many times you'd to an apartment and you'd hear 4 or 5 locks close behind you, and it was you and 4 or 5 people in the apartment who were not happy people. And if you didn't know how to talk to them, you were in a world of trouble because you weren't getting anybody through those doors that quickly.
Right. So being on your own, of course, there's also transit, at least where the radios didn't work. as I heard from another mutual friend of ours, Phil Grimaldi, you ride, we hide, New York City Transit Police. So with housing, I always like to ask this to, well, any cops that were coming on the job, rather they were transit, NYPD, or housing. What are some of the calls early on that were some real hair raisers?
One day I was actually riding in a radio car down on the Lower East Side. That's where I cut my teeth, was in Alphabet City. Myself and my partner, Kevin Mackin, got a radio call for an EDP with a pair of scissors threatening people in a hallway. When we got there and got up to the hallway, sure enough, there he was. And he was a pretty big guy with a pair of scissors. And it took us a little while to de-escalate and calm him down to get him to put the scissors down. That was pretty hairy. Another incident we had, I was maybe on the street, I would say less than 6 months. We did a car stop, 3 individuals in the car. We called for backup. Another car did show up. At that point, the guy in the back seat jumped out of the car and ran around the corner. Myself and one other officer gave chase. And as we turned the corner, he started firing at us. We returned fire. He was able to elude us, got into a building. I went in the building behind him. Unfortunately, the guy in the lobby, I said, where'd he go? He said he went up the stairs, and he said he went out the back door. I went out the back door, and he actually had gone up the stairs. 2 cops that were running behind me, they went up the stairs, encountered the individual, and unfortunately, he turned and pointed his weapon at the police, and he was shot and killed.
Man. And at this time, I mean, coming out in 80, I believe within a 2-year span, Jan Brinkers was shot and killed. Lieutenant Jan Brinkers off duty. He was trying to intervene in a robbery and they killed him. And then I believe James Carragher as well was gunned down, yep, also in the line of duty. So this is happening in a short span. You're a young guy.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make you happy, question your own mortality when you see these guys, experienced guys too, getting killed?
No, I this is going to sound strange to you, I guess, but that incident actually happened in slow motion. You could actually hear the bullets traveling through the air. Now, maybe it's my own imagination, but I know how I reacted to that. And it was pretty surreal. And the officer standing next to me was actually shot. That's why I continued to give pursuit, because somebody else came up to give him aid, and I continued to chase the guy. And no, I never really questioned my mortality. And to be honest with you, at that time, unlike now, where if you get involved in an officer-involved shooting, they rush you to the hospital and you don't talk to anybody, it wasn't quite that way. I ended up processing the 2 other collars. I worked about 40 hours straight. I went home, and the next tour I came back for, I was riding in a radio car with somebody on Avenue D, and a guy stepped out in front of us, pulled out a gun, and fired a shot at the RMP. And so here I am 2.5, 3 days later, and I'm chasing another guy through the projects with a gun who just shot at us. So I think it was just part of the job. It was part of what you were expected to deal with and expected to do.
That's real grunt work, though. I mean, granted, we don't want New York City to go back to that level of crime. We prefer that it didn't. And, it wasn't for a while. Now, unfortunately, things are starting to tick back up again, which is not a good sign. But that kind of work, I was having this conversation with somebody the other day that's also a retired detective who actually worked with your brother, Irma Rivera. She said your brother Billy was hilarious and she loved working with him. Yeah, Irma's the best. She's a close friend of mine. And she was saying, really that group of cops in the 80s, in the 70s and in the 80s, you guys really cleaned up the city. I'm not just saying that to say it. I mean, considering what the elements were, you had the crack craze, you had the AIDS craze on top of that too, which was equally bad. And to have to deal with all of that, and the amount of weapons that were on the street and the loose laws at the time, you talk about cutting your teeth. I mean, that in the fire department, they refer to their veterans as salty. I would say the same thing about that class in the 80s.
Yeah, I would absolutely say that. And, what was kind of ironic or strange, I guess, was when I first started, the NYPD, still their uniform force was not allowed to go after drug dealers on the street and things of that nature because they were still afraid of corruption. And then when the administration changed to Mayor Giuliani, that's when the gloves were taken off for them. But we, with the housing police, those, especially us young guys who had just come out, we were really gung-ho. We wanted to get out there and we wanted to make a difference. We wanted to clean up the streets. I was, in a short period of time, I was tired of standing in the projects and looking out, and the guy would stand across the street and he'd be dealing heroin a mile a minute. We would just walk over. They wouldn't even run away from us. We'd throw him up on the wall. We'd collar him. He'd have 100 glass scenes on him. And he goes, "You can't arrest me. You're a housing cop." I said, "See this? It's a city of New York. We can go anywhere." And then when Giuliani came in, all of a sudden now everybody was allowed to do that because, of course, you're always going to have corruption. But without enforcement, you see what's going on now. The lack of enforcement is leading us down that same road again, where we're going to have some serious criminal issues.
And that's an unfortunate trend. And some innocent people are going to get hurt. I mean, you often hear the old timers say, they reference the Brian Watkins incident in 1990, I believe, 1989, 1990, where he's a visiting tourist from Utah. He's trying to protect his mother from would-be robbers, I think in the subway, and he's stabbed to death. And that was the collective moment where people said, okay, that's enough. This is getting way out of control. And that was 1990. Did crime decline right away? No, it took a while. The end of the decade saw a significant decrease, but that was the genesis to where, even though that was a turning point for the better, I find it remarkably sad that it's probably going to have to take something like that, somebody really innocent and decent like he was, getting hurt, or worse yet, getting killed, for us to realize, we might need to turn the tide back.
Yeah, I believe that's probably an accurate statement on your part. The problem is, before, it was just really taking the handcuffs off the police. Now it's a far worse systemic problem because you have the courts involved, the DAs involved, and the politicians involved. It seems they want to punish the victims rather than the actual criminals. I heard something on the radio today that they were talking about subway crime being up And one of the MTA board members was blaming it on the people who weren't paying attention in the subway, because these are crimes of opportunity and they should be paying more attention. Well, and they claim that the police department agreed with that assessment. I absolutely do not believe in that assessment. I believe you should not be blaming victims for criminal activity.
There you go. Deputy Chief John Cutter is our guest here in the Mike Haven podcast. This is episode 116. We're happy to have John. But to go back to your earlier point about being gung-ho, you know, it's funny because 77 to 80, nobody was hiring. Firemen were getting laid off. Cops were getting laid off because the city was in a real bad spot. And I believe there was the infamous headline in the Daily News, President Ford, the late President Ford to city, dropped dead. You know, about the financial woes that was going on at the time, to where he's had these guys that they're going from going after guys with guns or marching into burning buildings to now having to drive a bus. And listen, nothing against bus drivers. They don't have an easy job either, but that's obviously not what they signed up for. They come back after the layoffs. And what's interesting is that here I heard that they basically felt reinvigorated by young guys like you and the other folks that were coming out at the time, because seeing how full of, as our buddy Mr. Wagner put it, piss and vinegar you guys were, quote unquote, it made them love the job again.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. I think, you know, I can speak for the housing police at the time. There was another sector unit that was out there that was a guy named Ron Welsh and Ronnie Martin. And they were the guys who got rehired after the layoffs and really were instrumental in being me, as well as a lot of other young guys, understand that, listen, you are the police. You do your job. You help clean up the streets, the city, the projects. And we used to run all the way from the 5th precinct up to the 9th precinct with one radio car. There were nights we handled 70 jobs in a night because there was that much activity going on. It wasn't always just making arrests, but the older guys who had come back from those layoffs definitely felt invigorated because they now had more support than, you know, a lot of the guys who were long in the tooth, and this is nothing against them. They had their day in the sun, but, you know, they're well over 20 some odd years. They're not looking to chase sneakers down the street and look for the bad guys. They're, you know, doing what they need to do to survive.
Right. So judging by where you ended your career as a chief, I would say it's fair to say you're a very ambitious guy. And the thing that I always hear cops talk about when I speak with them is study. When you're on the job, study, learn, take the time to observe how guys do the job. You can pick up lessons in not only what you should do, maybe even what you shouldn't do. And through that observance and through that studying is where you can get to where you want to get to. And certain guys stay in patrol their entire careers because they love it. That's fine. Certain guys stop a detective because that's what they want to do and they love it, and that's fine. But you went farther than that. When you came on the job, was your goal to, you know, were you always that ambitious from the beginning, or seeing how things operated as you went along, did that make you say, you know what, I'd really love to be in that guy's shoes one day?
Again, this may sound odd to you, but it was never that I was that ambitious or looking to move ahead. My attitude was, if you do your job, you're going to get recognized. And I was lucky in that, working with the housing police, it was easy to get recognized if you went out there, put your nose to the grindstone and kept moving forward and kept working. And I had gotten a lot of opportunity because when I got there, I was out there making a lot of arrests, making a lot of collars, and it was being recognized. I took the sergeants, lieutenants, and captains exam just to take them. I studied a little for each of them. I was fortunate enough to pass all 3 of them. And, you know, I was a lieutenant when we merged with the NYPD. And I figured, okay, my career is over. I'm going to be a lieutenant forever. And I thought I was going to go back to uniform. But in actuality, I had gotten a phone call from somebody in the NYPD who said, listen, your chief of detectives, at the time, it was a guy named Charlie Camadana, told us, you were the one lieutenant that we had to take care of. So where do you want to go? So I jokingly said, I want to go to arson explosion. Silence on the phone. I said, I'm only kidding. I said, anywhere in Brooklyn North would be great. If you're telling me I'm staying in the detective bureau, anywhere in Brooklyn North. So the guy breathed a sigh of relief, and next thing you know, I'm with a 9-0 squad, and which I spent about 18 months there, and then they moved me over to the 7-5 squad.
No love for the arson explosion squad from the upper brass? Come on.
Well, it's not no love, but to get there, that was a major, major accomplishment. So you really needed to know somebody. So the chief of housing detectives was not good enough to get me there. Although I never really wanted to go there. I just wanted to see their reaction.
No, of course. I believe, well, the commander of the unit at the time, I know him. I'm trying to get him on the show, Jerry Sheehan, great guy. Great guy. And that's not an easy unit to run, let me tell you, as I've found out from my mini-series profiling them in the bomb squad. So I was going to ask you, I mean, some cops loved the merger. And we're going to go back, before I segue fully into your career in the NYPD, I'll ask you a couple more questions about housing. But on the merger, some cops loved it, especially the transit guys. They got to come up and maybe do different things because now there's room for career advancement. You're not just stuck here, transit detective bureau or housing detective bureau. You can go to different units if you want to. But some cops hated it because they really loved where they were. They didn't want to change it. So when that merger happened, were you pro or were you anti?
I don't know if I really had a major opinion on the merger. I know a lot of guys, were scared of the unknown. And like I said, I thought, okay, yeah, we're going to merge. I'm going to be a uniform lieutenant somewhere in my career. But similar to my time in the housing police, where quite honestly, I'm very proud of the fact that I never had a hook. I never used any political influence with anybody to get ahead. It was, my attitude was, if you work hard and you do your job, you're going to be recognized. At some point, they need to put competent people in place. So you don't need a political hook to get there. So, immediately when we merged and I went to the squad, it was just another day at work for me. I had already worked with guys in the 9-0 squad, the 7-5, the 7-3, being the crimes captain in the housing police. I was all over the city, every homicide, every serious crime that happened, myself and my team, we were at it. So I already knew a lot of different commanders, detectives, lieutenants and sergeants in the NYPD. So it was really just another day at the office. And I was happy to end my career as a lieutenant in the squad. I was thrilled. It
Absolutely.
just didn't work out that way. It went a little better.
Yeah, there you go. So like I said, a couple more questions on housing. You were a zone commander in Brooklyn for a while. Then I want to get to major case because I can't gloss over that. That's really interesting stuff. But being a zone commander, okay, it's a little bit of a small area for my listeners. What the housing police used to have, and this continues now in the NYPD Housing Bureau since the merger, is what they call, for my non-police listeners, PSAs. It stands for public service, not public service, police service area rather. And they number it like 1, 2, 3, 4. And John was in one of those, running it in Brooklyn for a while. So now you're in charge of other cops. And not only do you have to ensure your own safety, but theirs. And some of these cops, I'm not knocking them or anything like that. They mean well, but you got to be the one sometimes pulling back and say, I don't know if you want to do this. So what were some of the lessons that you learned while doing that not only helped you bond better with the community you were serving, but be a good boss and look out for the guys and the gals that were working under you?
I was lucky in that when I was in the detective squad in housing as a cop, I was out in Coney Island, which was known as PSA 1. And I worked under a guy named Tommy Woods, and 2 other detectives were there, Buddy Murnane and John Ruiz, who were phenomenal guys to work with and for. And I learned a lot from Tommy Woods on how to be a boss and how to take care of your people. And making sure that everybody went home that night. So, I took a lot of lessons from that. So when I ended up a sergeant and then a lieutenant, and I had the zone, which was at that time for me, I had PSA 1 and 2. I covered a large geographical area. I had a lot of good detectives who worked for me and sergeants and other people. And I made sure that they knew that they had my backing and my support. And anything that they went out on, we would decide. And quite honestly, many times I was the first one out there with them doing search warrant, going through the door. Just to give you an example, we had an incident where an individual killed his girlfriend and her daughter in PSA 2. And we found a cab driver who was a friend of his who said, oh yeah, I picked him up afterwards and I drove him to my house and he's sleeping in the back bedroom. So we went there with a team and were able to secure the house. And when we went through the front door, just before we went through, we heard what sounded like a gunshot. When we went through the door, the individual had taken his own life. So I knew that I wasn't going to ask anybody to do something that I wouldn't do. And let's face it, the police department, it is an inherently dangerous business. And you have to recognize that, yeah, there is a possibility you could get hurt, you could get shot, you could get killed, but you still had to do your job and you had to do it to the best of your ability. And my thing was lead by example.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, an example of that, yesterday was the 25th anniversary of his passing, a fellow lieutenant, Federico Narvaez. Federico had a driver by that point. This is October 17th, 1996. He had a driver. He had 17 years in the job. He could do what you were saying earlier about the guys that had 20 something years or enough experience. He could take it easy and do what he had to do to survive. A woman flagged him down. This man's stalking me. What did he do? He went out to help. He was shot and killed for it. Thankfully, the responding officers did their part, saved the public of trial and killed the individual that killed Lieutenant Narvaez. But that's an example of, not doing something that he wouldn't ask others to do. And ultimately, sadly, in that instance, it cost him his life, but it was a heroic death and an honorable 17 years of service. So major cases I said I would get to, major investigations that go with it. I mean, there was some really notable cases, I believe a couple cop homicides too, Paul Heidelberger. I don't know if you worked that one, or John Williamson and Rudy Thomas in 93. But, for these cases, besides the cop homicides that we'll get to, what were some of the other cases that stand out?
Well, there was a case in an uptown project in Manhattan where a woman took her 3 children and poisoned them and poisoned herself. And they were all huddled up in a bathtub. And this was in the middle of the summer. She had all the windows closed and everything else sealed up tight. So it wasn't discovered for quite a while. And when we got there, not to sound disturbing, but it was like a giant gelatinous mass in the tub where the bodies actually melted together. And there was a lot of satanic Santeria drawings and different items in the apartment. We tried to figure out exactly what happened, and it turned out to be a murder-suicide because she believed that the demons were trying to possess her children. So to protect them, she actually killed them and killed herself to save them, as strange as that might sound. There were, there's multiple homicides of babies, whether thrown out a window, drowned in a toilet, dropped in a compactor. A lot of very disturbing cases that never made the news because they did happen in a project, or there was some other noteworthy thing that happened. Somebody stubbed their toe in Central Park, so a homicide project wasn't necessarily that newsworthy.
Cops and firemen, EMS, you guys see a lot of stuff that the average human never does, and quite frankly, never should see. And it weighs on you. A lot of guys and a lot of gals have some problems during their years in the job or even after they retire. So for you, what helped you to decompress and remember, for as much ugliness as I see, there is still a lot of beauty in life?
It actually happened early on for me as a young uniformed cop. And it's kind of a simple story, but as I said, my brother was in the 9th Precinct Detective Squad, which is down in the same area as PSA 4. And I had been working a post down at Smith Houses, which is in the 5th Precinct, really in the shadow of 1 PP, where a number of Asian victims were being robbed by a male who always wore a silver sports coat and always carried a 007. Now, I had a pretty good idea who that individual was. And although it wasn't necessarily protocol, I went over to my brother's squad. I talked to him, and I put a photo array together as a uniformed cop, which was really, you should never do that. You're supposed to go to the squad and let them do that. But I pretty much knew who it was. He helped me put a photo array together. I showed it to a couple of victims, and unfortunately, Asian victims, a lot of times they don't want to identify an individual, but I was fortunate enough that several of them did. And so I waited outside his building, and sure enough, he comes walking out. He's wearing the jacket. When I grab him, he's got the 007 on him. He confesses. We put him in a bunch of lineups. He gets ID'd. And then it goes to trial, and he gets 2 years for robbing about 15 people. So I was very disheartened at that point in time. And, my brother pulled me on the side, having a lot more experience than me. He said, listen, he goes, one thing you're going to learn, that this is a very ungrateful job, and you can't take everything to heart. Should he have gone to jail for much longer? Absolutely. But that's out of your hands. You did your part. You went and you got him. You put him behind bars, and the courts decided it was only worth 2 years. You can't let things get to you. You have to compartmentalize it, put it on the side, and say, okay, I'm still here doing my job. I'm doing my part. And, you ever hear the expression, ignorance is bliss?
Yes.
Well, after my entire career, and especially my last 4 years dealing with counterterrorism, I actually know what that means. And what I can tell you is I'm not blissful.
There you go. And I imagine that helped you too, because, as I was talking about my previous guest who did the first 5 years in housing before the merger, and then he went out to the bomb squad, housing is it's a much smaller department, to where, even though, listen, in a 36,000 department, let's be honest, if a cop gets killed in Queens, there's, not all the cops in Manhattan are going to know who he or she was. Are they going to be sad about it? Yeah, because it is a brotherhood and a sisterhood, but they don't know them personally. With housing and with transit too, it's much smaller. So I mentioned guys like Heidelberger, guys like Rudy Thomas, Freddie Bosch, who was the last housing cop to die before the merger. Other guys that got killed in the 80s, Tony McClain, just to name a few. When these guys died, is it that same principle that helped you kind of cope as best as you could with their deaths?
Yeah. And one name that is personally, involved in my career was a young man named Brian Jones, who was an off-duty PSA-4 cop who was killed in the confines of the 7-5, a little while after the merger. And, I worked on that case, and I worked on the Paul Heidelberger case. We worked jointly with the NYPD, since it happened not on the projects, but, on Bell Boulevard in one of the clubs there. And those cases affect you. But so do so many others that are just civilians and people that you remember. And I tell a lot of people when they ask me the question, they say, oh, how do you cope with it? I said, look, there's certain ones that you're going to have dreams about for the rest of your life, or nightmares, whatever you want to call them. And there's certain ones that you're always going to remember. But you have to figure out that, it's part of life. Unfortunately, being a cop, you take that chance every day you go out there. I know it's very cliche to say every time you go out there, you don't know if you're coming home, but you can't dwell on that. And the guys and girls that have been killed in the line of duty, whether on duty or off duty, because in most cases, even when they're killed off duty, they're trying to do police work. There's a special place for them, and you have to recognize that could be you tomorrow, but you can't dwell on it.
And that was Brian's case. I don't know if today's the anniversary of his death. I believe I don't know if it's today or the 23rd. The dates get jumbled in my mind, but I know he was looking to help a fellow officer make an off-duty arrest involving an assault, and a gun battle ensued, and he was killed. You guys called him Huggy Bear. That was a funny nickname I read about.
Yeah.
Huggy Bear.
No, you know, that was actually my last case in the 7-5 squad, because shortly thereafter I was promoted to captain, and I always remember that one.
Yeah, it's not easy. John Cutter is our guest here at the Mike Navin podcast. We're happy to have Chief Cutter on, and I'm enjoying the conversation with him, as I always do. The guests are always fun to talk to. So 9701, by this point, from where the decade was in 1990 to where it is now in 97, crime's down. We've gone through a few different commissioners. I mean, Safer's the commissioner at the time. He had just come over from the fire department, but nonetheless, the model that Ray Kelly put in there and then Bill Bratton is being followed to much success. So you talked about getting promoted to captain. Now you're working within the Manhattan North Bureau. It's a large portion of the city. It's the largest borough of the city. There's a lot to look after. Take me through some of the, not only just trying to make sure you stayed on top of everything, but the great people that you worked with too. I'd love to learn more about them.
There are countless people who worked throughout the Detective Bureau in every borough. But, when I worked in Manhattan, I first went there. Chief Farrell was the chief of Manhattan Detectives. And again, another guy that as a supervisor you could learn from, because he said to me one day, we went downtown to discuss a case. And while we were in with the chief of department and the PC, he was giving me, as well as some of my guys, accolades. And we walked out and I said, Chief, I said, that was really nice of you. I said, I appreciate you doing that. And he goes, John, you don't understand something. He goes, I'm smart enough to know that they know I don't do everything. And I'm also smart enough to surround myself with people like you and the other guys that make me look good. And he said, and ironically, he then tells me, because at that time I was a captain, he says, and that's because you're down here and I'm here. He goes, but when you get here, he goes, I will kill you if I have to stop moving ahead. And he was very honest about that. And unfortunately, within the police department, the pyramid gets tighter and tighter as you move up. But it was an interesting comment to hear from him early on as a captain. And I worked with some fantastic detectives. I was in charge of the Special Victims Unit, as well as the Homicide Squad, as well as the Gang Unit. And there were some great detectives. Guys like Frankie Garrido, Tanya Cawley, Mary Woods, in the Homicide Squad, Tommy McCabe, Rob Mooney. I'm going to leave out a lot of guys and girls. They were tremendous. They were the real backbone of the job. I'm really trying to remember one guy's name, and he's one of my favorites. We were out on a homicide. It was his last tour of duty before he aged out. His son ended up working for me years later in the Intel division. It was the last tour of duty on a 4 to 12. And he comes out there and we're on a block with nothing but 6-story walk-ups. And he walks up to me and he says, boss, what do you need? Breaks out his pad. He goes, I'll go canvass those 3 buildings. And his first name was John and his last name is escaping me right now. And I said, John, I said, this is your tour of duty. You don't have to do that. He says, boss, I want to do it. A detective. That's something that stuck with me forever. And there were a lot of guys like that. The guys I just mentioned, as well as countless other guys and girls. Billy Kiley, who was the CO of the 2-3 squad. Scotty Wagner was in the 2-3 squad. Paulie Morrison. God, I'm trying to think of so many other names. They made my job easy. They were phenomenal at what they did. And one of the things that I always believed in was detectives need to be allowed to do their job. You give them rope so that they can do their job. There was a point in time where all of a sudden the police department believed in an investigative checklist. And you used to go to CompStat as a boss and they would quiz you on the checklist, not necessarily on the cases, but on the checklist. And many cases with good detectives, instead of going A to Z, you'd go A, B, jump to E, then go back to D, and then from D, go all the way to Z, and now you got a collar. And then you do all the other work that goes along with making a solid case for the DA. But they were so hung up on that sheet that they turned detectives into these robots. And not only that, but a lot of the older guys, were basically pushed out of the job. So, oh yeah, we can get rid of that guy who's a first grade detective, and we can hire 3 guys for the same price. But the value and knowledge that you lost from getting those guys out of the job was terrible. There was a point in time where guys were coming out of the academy. They were being trained by a guy with 6 months on the job. I think that was a big shortcoming of the police department. You're training people with somebody who doesn't know anything yet other than 6 months of being on the street. Terrible, terrible. It just, that old time experience was really what helped make me the cop that I was.
My attorneys have just sent this over. Please note that the expressions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily reflect. No, I'm just kidding. I think you're right, though. I think you hit the nail on the head because, that's true. And you're losing that now to where I think this was written in the New York Post the other day to where there's this woman who's writing thank you letters to the NYPD. And it's a great story. And what she's saying is she used to see people on the street and come up to them. They had 30, 35 years, 40 years on the job. And you're not seeing that now to where if I see somebody that's still on the police department past 20 years, I'm like, wow, that's an anomaly almost. And it's unfortunate in that regard. It's funny. I was going to ask you about CompStat meetings because I had Chief Animo on the show a while ago. And to your point earlier about the pyramid, when I asked him, why'd you leave in 99? He says, I was going to throw somebody out a window. So there's that. But about those CompStat meetings, they can get very intense. I heard some stories about it previously of just how intense it could get. Did you look forward to those? I mean, obviously, if you had a good crime report, I imagine you did. But nonetheless, given how catty it could get at times, it had to be a thorn at times, I imagine.
Honestly, for myself, no. As the CEO of the 9-0 squad and then the 7-5 squad, my attitude was nobody knows my cases better than me. So you can quiz me all you want. And I knew every case that I had that they were going to talk to me about, all of my homicides, all of my shootings. I covered a lot of things. And quite honestly, there's a lot of mixed feelings about Chief Animo, but one thing I can say about him, he was a cop's cop. And if you were doing your job and you were not trying to soft sell him something, he respected you. I went back a long way. Even when I was with the housing police, he came out. We had 2 guys who were off duty. One was a housing cop. One was an NYPD cop. They were doing a side job as payroll couriers. And they got shot in the 9-0. It was a big shootout. They got shot. Chief Animo responds. Now, remember, I'm just a lieutenant in the housing police at the time. I was the guy out of everybody else there that briefed him because I knew from the minute I got on scene what was going on. And I briefed him. And that carried over when we merged to every time he would see me, he'd come up to me and go, John, what do we got? He'd bypass other people and he would talk to me. And CompStat meetings were very similar. He would ask all the hard questions. They would try to beat you up, but honestly, nobody knew my cases better than me. And I had answers for everything.
That's good. And I love that guy. He was so blunt. And what he said about kind of broken windows, which, before the merger helped housing too, and I imagine helped transit as well. And once the merger happened, even more so, is that with broken windows, you take the red tape away and let's just go do our job. We know what we got to do from the senior guy down to the newest guy. Let's go do it. And that's why you saw a 20-year crime drop to where, listen, obviously, 300 murders, for example, is 300 too many because life is a sacred thing. 1 is 1 too many. We don't want to see anybody die. But realistically speaking, in an imperfect world, in a city of 8 million people, to go from 2,000 to only 300, not that I'm minimizing the lives lost, what is that a product of? taking the red tape away and just saying, have at it, boys and girls, and do what you got to do. So January of 2001, we got another police commissioner in. Safer had left in August. Bernie Carrick comes in. I often make the joke that during the Giuliani administration, during the de Blasio administration too, not that I'm getting political, it's just a fact, there's been about as many police commissioners as Spinal Tap has had drummers. And here we are on the third one, and that's Bernie, who had only a short amount of time, but did what he had to do. And he asked you in January of 01 about leading the intelligence section. So, you know, he struck me as a forward-thinking kind of guy. He had success to his credit as corrections commissioner. He got crime down drastically there. So when he asked you about this in January of 01, tell me about what came next.
Well, actually, what happened was at the time I was the commanding officer of Manhattan Detective Operations, and I got a phone call to come down and see the commissioner. I walk into his office and he sits me down. He says, listen, he goes, I've been trying to get this project off the ground for several months now. And we've had people basically doing a think tank on this. And he goes, it's been highly recommended to me that you're the guy that can make this happen. So I want you to take over and build the criminal intelligence section, because initially before that, there was a criminal intelligence section, but it was 4 guys who worked on organized crime. And they did a phenomenal job, but it was only 4 guys. It was like 3 detectives and a lieutenant. He goes, I'll give you 1 captain of your choice, and then I'm going to give you 4 other captains, and you and that team will build this. So I said, okay. So we went to our first meeting, and I had met with the captain. I said, look, we're going to go into this meeting and we're going to be quiet. We're not going to say anything. We're going to listen to what everybody's got to say. Now, there was a chief in the room. There was an aide to Bernie Carrick in the room, and there were a number of other people. So we're sitting back and we're listening, and they start talking about, you know, well, how are we going to, you know, make these guys work, and how are we going to judge what they're doing? And so one person said, well, they'll be CompStat, so they'll be afraid of CompStat. So I didn't say anything. So the chief goes, they'll do it because I'm a chief, and if they don't do it, there'll be a problem. So at that point, I kind of lost my cool a little bit. And I start tapping on the table with my hand, and I look forward and I say, can I ask you a question? Has anybody here thought about positive reinforcement, about telling the guys what a great job they're doing as they're doing it? And they look and they go, well, they're just doing their job. I said, yeah, I know that. I said, but a pat on the back will go a lot farther than trying to beat them with CompStat or telling them I'm a chief. Nobody gets respect in rank by pointing at their lapel and going, look who I am. You have to earn that respect. And the way you earn that is by backing them and telling them what a good job they're doing. And quite honestly, from that point forward, some people were asked to leave by the police commissioner and let us take over and put the unit together. And I think by March, we had interviewed and selected, I think it was about 165 detectives, sergeants, and lieutenants of our choice. And at that time, I made a few enemies with the upper brass because there were no contracts allowed. The one thing I had asked the police commissioner was, I said, look, I said, if we're going to do this, allow us to pick the team. Don't force people down our throats. And he said, okay, you got it. And, you know, unfortunately, some people tried to push some people on us. Listen, there's plenty of good spots for people who are on the job but aren't really looking to work that hard or be chasing sneakers on the streets. We wanted guys who were good detectives, good investigators, good supervisors who knew their way around investigations. And ironically, Commissioner Carrick at the time said, you know, I want this unit to collect intelligence on criminal gangs the way the federal government collects intelligence on terrorist organizations. So to me, the irony there was when 9/11 happened, we were already in place and just had to shift gears.
And that day, which we'll get to in a moment, definitely changed the operations going forward. But that's, you know, it's good that he at least gave you the leeway to do that, and that no politics, at least to a large portion, played into it, because listen, it's a unit that's still running to this day and still functioning at a very high degree. But I love what you said, because listen, do you want to coddle people? No. Do you want to baby people? No. I mean, there has to be a standard. And I understand in a paramilitary organization, keeping guys and gals sharp and on their toes, but it doesn't hurt once in a while, especially like you said earlier, in a job where they may walk out the door one day and not come back, to tell them, hey, I appreciate what you're doing. It's not going to kill you. I mean, and not even in the police or in the fire department, anywhere. It doesn't hurt to walk up to someone and say, thanks for all you do. Because listen, life's unpredictable. We saw that in the last year and a half of the pandemic. It could be that person that you see one day is not there. And what are you saying for the rest of your life? I wish I would have told them how much I appreciated them.
Yep. No, absolutely. I'm a firm believer in positive reinforcement. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I generally don't do that. But I can tell you, to this day, there are still guys who tell me they wish I would have stayed there longer, that they enjoyed working for me, and they would go through a wall of fire to do whatever had to be done to do it right.
Can you manage the Yankees? Because the Yankees could use that right now.
Yeah, that's beyond me. I'll do Little League, not the Yankees.
Yeah, I'm not a happy Yankee fan these days, and they brought back Aaron Boone, which I'm not looking forward to. So there's that. But that day, September 11th, 2001, as I always ask my NYPD FDNY guest, take me through where you were and what you did.
That morning, I was actually getting dressed and ready when I got a phone call that said a plane just hit the World Trade Center. And I said, what do you mean? I said, a little plane? They go, no, a big plane. So I flipped on the TV, and of course, they already had coverage going. I jumped in my car, and it was almost a surreal experience in that I was flying down the LIE to get to the city, and there was nobody else on the road. The state police in Nassau County and Suffolk County had shut down every exit. And the only way you got on was if you were a first responder, fire department, police department. So there was virtually nobody on the road. And I came across the viaduct to the Midtown Tunnel as the first tower fell. So I saw that to my left as I was coming into the city, and then quickly got down to the scene. And my guys had already started gathering information and intelligence about what people saw, what people heard, what people said. We really started on a street corner. I said, okay, let's go do this. I'm not looking to bore you, but the way the story goes is I had 165 detectives and investigators and sergeants and lieutenants working that, right? And for the first 3 days we did. And then it came down that the feds did not want us doing anything. They were going to take it over. We had to follow their lead. And whether the police department likes it or not, at that time, they were told to stand down. Now, at the time, we were working out of one of the commands that had an administrative office, but also had a detective squad in the same building. First couple of days, the detectives that were in that squad were up working with us as well. The third day, they told us, listen, we're not allowed to come back up and work with you guys. So I said, okay, that's fine. I got a phone call, you got to stop. I said, listen, this is my city. I'm not stopping. We're gathering intelligence. And as we gather it, we're passing it along. I don't see any harm in having 160 plus people out there pulling up intelligence, whether they like it or not. And within a day, I got a phone call from the head of the JTTF on the NYPD side. And he said to me, John, he goes, listen, they kind of figure they can't stop you. So they want you to bring your guys and come over to the Intrepid and work with us. So all of my guys went to the Intrepid and were assigned out of there. And that's how we got started in the terrorism game, or the counterterrorism game, as criminal intel.
And not only that, listen, the FBI did lose somebody that day. That was Special Agent Lenny Hadd, who got killed. But wait a minute, if I'm in your position, I fully understand it. Wait, did you guys lose 23 cops? No, we did. We watched 23 of our brothers and sisters die, not to mention 3,000 people die and two of the tallest buildings we had. We lost our brothers in the fire department, our brothers and sisters in Port Authority PD. I think we have a say in this investigation. So I totally understand that, because there's that raw emotion. As you said, it is your city. I mean, you know, and that was an iconic symbol, and still is, even 20 years after their destruction, of what New York City is all about. So I don't know if you knew any of the 23 officers that perished, but if you did, I'd love to learn more about it.
Yeah, I did. A couple guys in particular. I mean, I knew probably every one of the emergency service guys. Ronnie Clofer, we grew up together. Another guy, Brian Coughlin, was my driver and partner when I worked up in the Bronx in the housing police. He had been a housing cop as well.
John Coughlin.
Yeah, John, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about another Coughlin, Brian. Yeah, John was my driver and my partner when we worked up in PSA 8 together. Then there were a couple of guys who had switched over to the fire department. Danny Harlan and Kenny Kumpel. Kenny Kumpel was a kid that I used to play stickball with when I was a kid. He ended up going to the fire department, and he was killed that day. And Danny Harlan started as a housing cop, switched over to the fire department, and he perished that day. You know, there's a lot of people that I knew died that day, and it was a day that I never want to see be relived.
Of course. If we're thinking about the same Brian Coughlin, I believe, if I have the right Brian Coughlin, he's a sergeant in the bomb squad right now. Or are we thinking about a different? Yeah. I know him because I'm friends with a lot of guys in the bomb squad. I don't know him directly, but him and I follow each other on LinkedIn. Good guy. Hopefully when he
used him with John, but
yeah, you know, when he retires, because the active guys, it's tricky to get him on. Sergeant Coughlin, hey, you know, you see all the other guys that you worked with that I've had on the show. Come on the show, pal. You know you want to. So afterwards, I mean, there is the resilience aspect. Okay, we've been knocked down. They knocked down our buildings. We've lost so many good people. But we can't sit around crying about this, for as hard as it is. We got to get back on our feet, and we got to make sure that, as you said, this doesn't happen again. So Now you're running this, and you guys are essentially given carte blanche. So many federal money was poured into this. And when Ray Kelly came back in January of 2002, and say what you want about Kelly. I mean, you talked about people having mixed feelings about Anemone. I know some people love Ray Kelly, some people don't. You got to give the guy credit where it's due. He came in 4 months after the darkest day the city ever had, and with the rubble still smoldering, and built a world-class counterterrorism operation almost from scratch. Now, I don't want to say completely from scratch, because as you were talking about, intelligence was already in gear, but he expanded it in such a way that really opened the door for the NYPD to do a lot of things, not just at home, but abroad too, to gather information. So when the toolbox expanded, how, without getting into detail and giving things away that should stay under wraps, of course, tell me how you used it and benefited from it.
Well, you know, what was nice is when Commissioner Kelly came in, who I have the utmost respect for.
Me too.
Another guy like Anemone, who, no nonsense. You tell him the truth. Don't try to BS him. Do your job, and you're fine. You can make mistakes, but you're going to have to be truthful about it. Don't try to sugarcoat anything. But when he came in, he brought in Deputy Commissioner David Cohen to run intelligence. And, you know, he came into the Intel division, and he pushed a few senior officers out to other locations. And I got a phone call one day, and they said, bring everything you have on the criminal intel section to the commissioner. He wants to see it. So I had this box full of these cases. You know, we had only got started in March, but between March and September, we had done so much work. It was incredible. Like I said, we had some of the best that was working in that unit. So I took this giant box of information. I go to his office, which was out in Brooklyn. I walk in. He says, "Oh, hey, how you doing? Nice to meet you." He was a little bit jumpy type of guy, a little bit. And he says, "Oh," I says, "Yeah, this is everything. I got to catch a train. Just leave that there. You know, I'll look at it on Monday." This was a Friday. So we talked for 5 or 10 minutes, and he goes, "Okay, I'll see you around." So I leave. A little while later, I call his secretary, and I ask her, I said, "Annette," I said, "what happened after I left?" She goes, "He put his coat on, took your box, and said, I got a lot of reading to do this weekend." said, okay. So that very next week, I get a phone call. Yeah, the commissioner wants to see you. I said, okay. I figure I'm about to get axed because the two guys that were either my rank or above me were already gone and moved to another assignment. I figured, all right, he's going to bring in his own guys. He's going to bring in who he wants. So I go there and he goes, come on, let's go out to lunch. So we go to this little dive in Brooklyn where no one in their right mind would order a meatball sub. And he orders a meatball sub. Now, he had been a former CIA guy, so I'm assuming this must be a CIA front because nobody would order a meatball sub here. We sit down, we're eating, we're talking. He looks at me square in the eye and he goes, you know, I was sent here to kill you, right? I said, yeah, I kind of figured that. I said, so where am I going? He goes, you're not going anywhere. He goes, you built something that I would have had to build if it wasn't here. We need to tweak it. We need to adjust it. We need to refocus the mission. He goes, but I need you to run it. Will you do it? And I said, yeah, of course, I'll do it. And that's how the criminal intel section began under Ray Kelly and David Cohen in that fashion. And, you know, we built things like the Hercules Project. We built, the overseas liaison program where, you know, we used to have to rely on the FBI to tell us about a communique that came in from France about a terrorist operation or Israel, you know, and Commissioner Cohen, to his credit, and Commissioner Kelly, they said, you know what, we're going to start putting our own people out there and gathering our own intelligence. And, you know, there were a lot of bumps and a lot of bruises with the federal agencies that we were working with. And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of tremendous guys in the FBI, George Venezuelos, Joe Demarest, Rich Kelly, that I worked with over the years. And they were phenomenal. They were really good guys to work with and good partners on the federal side. But, you know, we had to kind of set the parameter. What were we going to do? Now, you still had members of the NYPD and the JTTF, which was greatly expanded and ran under a great guy named Charlie Wells. And they were working on terrorism. What we did was we went to them and sat down because it was like, you know, they were starting to feel we were encroaching on their territory. And I said, look, we're not working on known terrorists. We're not working on known terrorist organizations. What we're working on is everything under that. Because if you look at crime as a pyramid, 3% at the very top is terrorism and 97% is not. But just under that 3%, there's probably 5 or 6, 7% of crime that are precursors to terrorism, whether it's guys who are, you know, selling counterfeit tax stamps for cigarettes. There were a lot of other types of crimes that were going on that were actually helping to fund terrorism. There were hawalas, which were money lenders within the Muslim community. They were skimming money off there and sending it over to different terrorist organizations. And we would work on that level. And as it percolated up to within that 3%, you mentioned the attempted Times Square bombing. You know, that was a case that came out of the criminal intel section that came to fruition because of the investigators in the criminal intel section. That was not initially an FBI job. And had we not been there to investigate that, that might have actually happened. And then we would have been investigating the incident rather than taking them down before it actually happened. There were a lot of things like that the criminal intel section did. And I'm very proud of the men and women there that did those things.
Absolutely. Because, you know, as I was having this conversation, I use this line often. My pal Bill Ryan from Arson and Explosion, you know, he says, hey, somebody asked him one time, so how many bombings do you get? He says, it's not the bombings you get, it's what you prevent, you know, and so many plots have been prevented since then to where, you know, I noticed, listen, 9/11, there's a lot of factors that led to 9/11, one of them being an intelligence failure, not on your end, obviously, but on the federal level, to where bin Laden literally said in interviews, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not trying to be funny because it's not, but it's basically, he said, you know, I hate you guys, right? You know, I want to attack you guys, right? And I'm gonna. And he did. And collectively, the process was, you know, okay. And they didn't act on it until it was way too late. And all the lives, you know, that didn't need to be lost were lost. And so, you know, I remember hearing about it because and this happened after you retired, when the Madrid bombings happened in 2004 and when the London bombings happened in 2005, they were already sending guys over there, if they weren't stationed over there already, giving information back to headquarters at the NYPD. And even if it didn't have a link to New York, in the event that it does, let's make sure we're prepared. And that's the beauty of the operation. And, you know, two guys that you mentioned there, David Cohen and Charlie Wells, I got to get them on my show. I've been trying to get Charlie forever. I don't know if he'll do it, but Charlie, if you're listening, I need to get you on the show, brother. I'd love to talk to you. So I want to move ahead now to 2004. You retired after 24 years. You did a lot, as we've covered. What was the factor that led to you saying, all right, time to go?
I had two kids about to start going to college at the same time and needed to make more money, to be honest with. And I wasn't actively pursuing anything, but one of the bosses underneath me walked in and he threw a newspaper in front of me that had a blind ad looking for a chief investigator. And so, you know, it said, oh, fax your resume here. So I faxed my resume. Next thing you know, I get a phone call and I get an offer at that time, which was probably too good to be true. And it made me say, okay, I can afford my kids going to college. And, you know, at that time I was a 1-star chief. And, you know, if I stayed and I made 2 stars, it was a nominal raise. It wasn't a big difference in money. There were, you know, no overtime as a chief. So in order for me to make money, it would have either been stay on the job and get a second job, which would have been impossible based on the hours that I was doing because of 9/11. And so I felt the unit was in a good enough position that other people could come in and run it and continue doing God's work.
Before we get to the concluding segment, and it's been a great show, I do want to ask you, you're an author too. You co-wrote a book called The Squad Room, partially inspired by some truthful experiences in your life and the co-author's life. Take me through the decision to write a book, and of course, that working with what sounds like another interesting guy I should try to reach out to, a heck of a co-author.
Yeah, well, Bobby Nivikov started as a Port Authority cop. Although he doesn't like to admit that. Quickly moved up to Connecticut and went on to Stanford Police, where he elevated himself all the way up to the chief of department, which, you know, is some feat in and of itself. Very progressive thinker. One day I get a phone call from him. I had met him and had been dealing with him for a little while. And I also had met the mayor of Stanford, a guy named Mike Pavia. And Bob calls me one day and says, listen, he goes, you know, I'm writing a book. He goes, but it really centers around New York City. And, you know, I was talking to Pavia and he said, you should get John involved because he's really got the New York experience. So he goes, would you want to get involved? I said, yeah, sure. And he goes, you know, I'm a little ways into it, but, you know, I said, look, I said, I'm not just going to put my name on something. If you want me to do this with you, we'll do it together and we'll write together and we'll come up with a good storyline. And interestingly enough, I would say there's a lot of real situations in that book. Obviously, some of it is elevated with some of the characters, obviously for the reader's enjoyment. Right. But pretty much every character in the book is somebody either myself or Bob knew, or at least created the character based on them. And ironically enough, there's one guy in particular, his name is Garriga. He's a little Cuban guy, tough as nails, boxer. And he knocks a much bigger guy out, another detective out one day. And that was a detective who worked with me. Obviously not by that name, in Special Victims. And I modeled that character after him. And when Bob is reading that passage, because that was something I had added to the book, he goes, wait a minute, that's so-and-so. And he names a guy. He goes, yeah, he was a Cuban guy, worked for me. Totally different guy, but the same guy. Same thing with the female detective who actually ends up being one of the real heroes in the story. And every one of the guys that's in that story is somebody that we both personally knew and took their characteristics and obviously changed the names. And a lot of the stories are true that are in there. They really happened to either Bob or myself, and we were able to put it together and come up with a book.
It's a book that I need to add to my reading list. It's called The Squad Room, and I'll link it in the description of this podcast. So this has been a lot of fun. I know you're busy, guys, so let me try to speed through the lightning round now. I'm glad that you came on. It's called Rapid Fire, 5 hit-and-run questions from me, 5 answers from you. Are you ready? All right, so the first thing, you kind of touched on it earlier. We talked about it, but nonetheless, I'll ask you, favorite boss you ever had? And you can name multiple.
Oh, God. Tommy Wells, for sure. Guys that I worked with, Donnie Durando was another good boss. Charlie Wells, when he was a captain and I was a lieutenant. Bob Kincaid, who was a captain when I was a lieutenant. I mean, I'm leaving out a ton. Kevin Farrell as the chief of Manhattan Detectives was great. Joe Esposito, obviously, department. So many good guys. And I know I'm forgetting the other chief. Oh, God, he's going to kill me. Big, tall guy. He was the chief of Brooklyn SATCOM. Joe Dunn, another fantastic guy that I worked for. Eddie Cannon. There were a lot of really good ones.
There you go. So I'm gonna tweak this question a little bit. So focusing strictly on the first 15 years of your career pre-merger, thing you miss most about the housing police?
I think that the sense of community with the community. For some reason, as a housing cop, people seem to be more willing to talk to you. And I mean, I can tell you there were a number of instances where you're in the middle of the project all alone and you've got a problem, and somebody out a window who could be somebody who arrested a month ago, but you were nice to, or somebody else just looking out the window is calling the police for you to help you, to come and save you from what could be a terrible incident. I think that sense of community, it was a little different because we didn't always ride around in radio cars. You got out and you walked around, and I know the NYPD at that time, they were people strapped. And so they were pretty much in radio cars riding from job to job and didn't get that chance to mesh with the community.
Third, best advice anyone ever gave you?
I think, as I said earlier, what Chief Farrell told me, that, they're smart enough to know that you don't know everything and you don't do everything. But if you get too close to me, I'm going to kill you.
Note to self, don't get too close to Chief Cutter. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, man, there were so many back in the days. McSorley's definitely is high on that list. There was another Irish bar that was on 23rd and I believe 1st or 2nd, which is no longer there. The Glockamora, I think it was called. That's gone. But yeah, I guess McSorley's is probably tops on that list.
Fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a young John Cutter, either about the job, about life, whatever?
Try to figure out a way to make enough money that I could have stayed on the job longer.
There you go. And it concludes another fun episode that I was really, really happy to do. I've been working on for a while, and I'm glad that I was finally able to get Chief Cutter on. I'd like to do a tip of the hat to Scotty Wagner and Phil Grimaldi, 2 detectives that worked underneath John. Those 2, by dropping their names, sorry to be a name dropper, but by dropping their names, that kind of was able to help me get Chief Cutter here. So before we go, if you got any plugs or shout outs that you want to give to anything or anyone in particular, floor is yours.
The only thing I would say is, if you do enjoy a good crime story, pick up the Squad Room. It's not really expensive on Amazon, and they also have it on the Kindle. It's a great read. Everybody who's read it has applauded it and enjoyed it.
Chief Cutter also has a private investigation firm. I'll link that in the description too. Cutter Investigations. If you need a PI for whatever you may need a PI for, I'll make sure to get him in touch with Chief Cutter. That way Chief Cutter can help him out. So on my end, My shout outs to you, the listeners, always. Thank you for being here. We're over 100 shows now. I started this show back up after a 2-year hiatus to finish college in December, and we have now done with today's episode 75 shows in almost a year span, 11 months. So it's been a marathon, but I wouldn't have it any other way. So thank you to everybody, as always, for making this show possible. Twitter, Mike in New Haven, Instagram, original_MC1, LinkedIn, Mike Colón, then type in MIC_D. So coming up on the Mike in New Haven podcast Friday, as I said before, Ashley Banfield, formerly of CNN and MSNBC and currently of News Nation. Looking forward to talking with her. And next week, a friend of mine, I'm trying to get her for a while, and finally she'll be coming on. Allie Bauman, who's a reporter for Channel 2 in New York City, CBS New York. She's did a great job in the last year covering COVID and everything else. And I'm going to be getting her on the show next Tuesday. So looking forward to those 2 episodes, respectively. On behalf of retired Chief John Cutter, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.